Sword Art Online, Progressive, Canon of the Golden Rule, and written by Reki Kawahara, illustrations by abec, designed by BP, translated by Stefan Paul, read by Mae Zurita. 6th floor of Eincrad, January 2023. 6. I awoke to movements that weren't mine. Warmth that wasn't mine. Breathing that wasn't mine. Through cracked eyelids, I saw the faint white-gray light of morning. Based on the color, I gauged it to be around 5 in the morning. Normally, I'd still be asleep at this hour, but I'd gone to bed very early and had already gotten 9 hours of sleep. We were set to meet with Kismal in the mess hall at 7, so there was still time to relax, but I decided it was better not to be lazy. And yet, my eyes closed again. The chilly air of early January morning versus the absolute comfort and warmth of the bed was simply an unfair fight. My partially awakened mind sank back down into the darkness. Just 30 more minutes. No, 20. I thought, like a middle schooler on a Monday morning, and then tried to turn off my brain. But then there was a faint and a sensation of writhing next to me. At first I thought I was having a dream about owning a cat, but then I realized it was neither a cat nor a dream. My eyelids were so heavy that they felt like they'd been glued together. Even though the virtual world didn't make use of your actual eyes, the way it made it impossible to focus when in half-sleep state was oddly true to life. Probably an issue between the brain and the nerve gear. I blinked repeatedly until the gray blur sharpened into a proper image. The upper half of my field of view was dominated by a large pillow, while the bottom half was a light brown something. I was resting on my side, I could tell, and my right arm was extended forward, trapped between the brown object and the pillow. My left arm was resting on a soft object, and my legs felt intertwined with something as well. They were either trapping or it was being entrapped themselves. It was hard to tell for sure. I blinked some more, using my free arm to try to push away the enigma stuck on my body. Came another murmur from somewhere under my chin. The soft object my left hand was touching suddenly wriggled. It wasn't a cat of any other small animal. It was a large animal, about my size, a human, a player. Specifically, it was my temporary partner, Lady Asana. The brown object resting on my right arm was Asana's head. The instant the situation registered in my mind, it accelerated from a dazed state past normal attention into hyper-focus. As my mind got up to speed, I chose my course of action. Apparently, I had offered my arm as a pillow space and had my free hand holding her shoulder. I was on my right side, and Asana was on her left, meaning that our fronts were nearly in total contact, and I couldn't tell what was going on with our legs. I moved my eyes without craning my neck to glance up at the headboard. I was firmly on the left side of the bed, meaning that I was the one violating the territorial treaty. We were only holding pinkies when we went to sleep, so during the night I had somehow advanced all the way from east to west. Asana budged again. The intervals of her activity were getting shorter, within minutes. Perhaps less than a minute, she would likely awaken. I had to retreat to my territory on the right side of the bed before that happened. Carefully, I let go of Asana's shoulder and let my hand hover in the air, but my right arm was still trapped between her head and the pillow, and removing it would prove difficult, not to mention our legs, which were all tangled. At this point, the only way to free myself without disturbing Asana would require a teleport crystal, but those only allowed for teleport to various town teleport gates, and more importantly, they weren't available on the 6th floor. Still, I had time to attempt it, should I believe in miracles, and I didn't have much other choice. I tried to use my left hand to lift up Asana's head. If I could get my right arm free, I might be able to undo our legs and escape. The moment my fingers brushed the back of her head, Asana grimaced. I quickly moved my hand away. She wriggled for a few more seconds, then unfolded her hand right in front of her and clenched my shirt collar. I'm so dead. At this point, all I could do was let my muscles go limp and wait for the hateful moment to occur. 2 hours later. Why are you putting your fish on Asana's plate, Kirito? Do you not like fish? Kismel asked me. We were in the dining hall. With a sad, secretive smile, I replied, No, I love fish, in the dry tone of a sample sentence in a language textbook. Then why are you giving it all away? I was at a loss for an appropriate response. Instead, Asana stuck her fork into the fried fish I was offering her and happily explained, Kirito did something bad, so he's paying for his crime. Oh, what did he do? Well, Asana started, but before she could detail the entire incident, I interjected. You see, I kind of invaded Asana's personal space, meaning that I got a little too physically close for her comfort, I said, to explain the English terminology of personal space. I got a cold glare from the fencer for my comment. Yes, the act of embracing someone in bed was beyond the level of violation of personal space, but if Kismel was going to be disgusted with me too, I might as well spend the entire day doing squats in the corner of the castle by myself. I prayed that she would understand and accept this explanation, assuming that she actually wouldn't. But, to my good fortune, Kismel nodded deeply and earnestly. I see. It is the first time I have heard this term, but I understand your meaning. In elf society, too, it is considered a violation of norms to approach another too closely. Oh, really? Asana asked Asana to my right. She set down her cup of herbal tea and wondered, But when you're around us, you don't seem to keep your distance, Kismel. In the Queen Spider's dungeon on the 3rd floor, you ushered us under your cape for hiding, for example. Indeed, I recall being rather flustered on how much contact there had been with her arm and legs and other body parts. The elf knight smiled wistfully and glanced at her own hands. Yes, I do recall that. It would seem that, compared to other dark elves, my personal space is rather narrow. Tilnell did like to cling to me after all. We're practically joined at the hip when we are children, so I suppose I became used to the feeling. I could sense Asana's eyes widening when Kismel mentioned the name of her late sister, who had died in the battle with a forest elven falconer on the 3rd floor. Asana and I never met till now. In fact, I was under the assumption that there had never actually been a dark elf NPC in Aincrad named till now. Kismel's childhood with her beloved sister, and the point at which she became a knight and Tilnell became a herbologist, and Tilnell's death during the mission to recover the sacred key. All these things had to be backstory, details invented and placed in Kismel's memory. For one thing, elves were long-lived. So Kismel was older than she appeared, perhaps 50 or 60, or even older than that. Yet the world of Aincrad itself had only been around since November 6, 2022, less than 2 months ago in the real world. But after all my interactions with Kismel, Viscount Euphilis, and even old Romolo, the camp blacksmith, the way of thinking was slowly evolving. These things seemed too rich and complex just to be simple generated memories that were implanted to define the characteristics and give them individuality. In the present day of 2022, no, it was 2023 now, I had to remind myself, humanity had yet to develop a properly functioning AGI, or Artificial General Intelligence. Artificial intelligence itself made great strides 5 years since 2017, which was now considered the first year of the AI era. There were shogi and go apps you could install on your smartphone that were tougher than any pro player programs for stock and currency trading that could perform thousands of transactions per second for efficiency gains. And hospitals now had tools to automatically perform diagnostics with high-res imaging. It wouldn't be long now before we reached level 5, the point where fully automated cars were driving around on public streets. But compared to the rapid advancements of these narrow AI, which were focused on specific tasks, we still had a long way to go to develop a general AI that was capable of learning on its own and communicating on the same level as a human being. The AI could be applied to a wide variety of areas. Smart speakers were found in homes all over the world, helping with schedule management, home appliances, and informational searches. But they were clearly unable to contribute meaningfully to conversation. For one thing, AI are good at learning about things with clear outcomes, winning and losing, correct and incorrect, but struggle greatly when there is no correct answer to discern. The concepts of winning and losing don't apply to normal conversations. Yet here before me, sipping her herbal tea with a pensive, thoughtful look, was a dark elf NPC in a video game. Not exactly the pinnacle of cutting-edge AI development, who had never given us a nonsense response to any statement. Perhaps that was partially because we'd been avoiding bringing up any topics that Kismel would not understand. But even then, her ability to make conversation was essentially at a human level. How had Argus, had Akihito Kayaba, managed to implement such a high-functioning AI in a video game? There was only one way I could imagine: to build up an enormous text corpus of conversations between a vast number of human and AI on a specific topics, then reduce statistical noise and computational stress. That would not be easy, of course. It would be hard enough just to get hundreds of people to participate and explain what was allowed to discuss and what was off limits. There would be an issue of how to recruit them and how to pay them for their time and efforts. But in a VR MMO world, players would generally only speak about in-game topics and quests who needed to pay for them, and who would happily log in and spend hours in the game at a time. If thousands of players spoke with AI over the course of a month, it would accumulate the kind of data that no company of researchers had ever gotten their hands on before. Then, using that text corpus, they could have AIs talk to one another. Once actual humans were out of the picture, that conversation can be simulated much, much faster. In 2 months, you could simulate centuries or more of dialogue between individuals' AI, meaning that it was possible that Kismel and the Dark Elves and the Forest Elves and the Fallen Elves and human NPCs had all built up an actual history that started from the creation of Aincrad before SEO officially launched. Among them were special AIs with conversational abilities close to general intelligence, such as Kismel and Viscount Yoflis. In my imagination, my daydream, was even in the vicinity of the truth, then SEO's AI capabilities was already in that near future realm. Now you only had 10 times as many players in the beta, a full 10,000 in Aincrad, all trading words with AIs every day. Could that be data be accumulated, refined, and polished enough to lead the production of a crown jewel of true artificial intelligence? I certainly couldn't categorically rule it out. Kirito, a poke at my elbow brought me to a rapid series of blinks. What? Don't what me? Was it that much of a shock that I took your fish? You've barely eaten a bite so far. Oh. I looked down at my plate, where I still had 2 pieces of fried fish after the one I'd offered to Asuna, and I hadn't even touched my salad or toast. The day's adventure was expected to be a long one, so I needed to fuel up while I could, even if the calories weren't real. I stabbed a piece of fish with my fork and shoved the whole thing in my mouth. The crispy fried portion crumbled apart, giving way to a juicy chunk of white meat. As I cleaned my plate, I couldn't help but wonder if Kismel and her kind felt the same sensations of taste and contentment. Once I had polished off my food, I gulped down my herbal tea. I wasn't asking you to inhale it, you know, Asuna muttered. I leaned over and bit down on an elliptical baby tomato stuck on one end of her fork, pulling it off. Ah! What was that for? Asuna raising her fork to swing, and I held my knife to defend against it. Kismel only shook her head, a big sister gesture if I'd ever seen one. Asuna noticed it and lowered her arm. Hey Kisnell, can you tell us more about Tilnell? Why yes, of course. I shall tell you some stories on our travels today. Great, I can't wait to hear them. Asuna beamed, earning her a grin from the dark elf. There was no hint of a shadow in her expression this time. After our meal, Kismel guided us to the supply station of Castle Galley. There were various generous offerings of 5 healing potions, 5 antidote potions, and a bag with rations and snacks once per day for free. Sadly, the antidotes were only level 1, so they couldn't counteract the level 2 paralyzing poison from Morche's spine of Schmargor throwing picks. The prospect of finding an antidote that was effective against the poison had me excited to hear from the storyteller, and Kismel had mentioned last night, but unfortunately, we could only meet them in the library between noon and 3 o'clock. I didn't like the idea of continuing our questing without a means to neutralize the poison picks, but we would probably be fine as long as Kismel was with us. She had a ring with a magical antidote charm. And I couldn't imagine that Morche's gang would attack an elite knight whose level was so higher that her color cursor must seem black. Based on the way the dagger user, aka Black Hood number 2, had given up his main weapon to try to save Morche, or Mamoru, as he called him, they didn't engage in that stunt expecting to sacrifice their lives. But that just meant that when they tried to attack us again, it would be under even more advantageous circumstances than the other night. The next time, they would do whatever it took to kill us, and they probably working on a diabolical plan at this very moment. I felt a fresh wave of apprehension about the idea of just waiting for them to make their next move, but I couldn't think of a way we could strike them first. Even if I did have a plan, I would need willpower on a different level than what I was working with for now. For one thing, assuming we knew where the hideout was, there was no surefire method for apprehending a player in Aincrad for long periods of time. The only way to prevent them from committing any more evil would be to permanently log them out of the game. And the only way to do that at this point was to reduce their HP to 0, which would bring about death of the player in real life. Hey Kirito, we're heading out. Don't make us leave you behind. I lifted my gaze from the tiles on the floor to the distance, where I saw the knight and fencer beckoning me towards a spring at the roots of the spirit tree. The branches and leaves of the massive tree, which emerged from the center of the pool, glistened dazzlingly with countless droplets of dew that caught the morning sun and trickled down like golden threads. The sight of 2 women against this backdrop was astonishingly beautiful. Kismel was Kismel, of course, but at this point, Asuna might be stronger than me in pure fighting prowess as well. Even still, I felt a powerful urge to protect the 2 of them surge up in my heart as I trotted over to join them. We were ushered out of the castle gates by the sound of light bells and the silent gazes of guards. After barely a minute of walking across the bridge over the sandy valley floor, devoid of so much as a blade of grass, an unfamiliar debuff icon appeared on Kismel's HP bar. The symbol of a person hanging their head was the status icon for weakness, I recalled. I only suffered it once in the beta, fighting against the snake priests of the Castle of 1,000 Serpents on the 10th floor. It wiped out a large portion of my strength and ability stats, which put me in an unencumbered state. Unable to run away to safety, I was killed as soon after that. Kismel didn't look that bad, but I could tell in the brief time that I had been to that her rich coffee brown skin was looking noticeably paler now. Asuna called out her name in concern and tried to offer her an arm, but the knight boldly pushed her away and removed a thin cape from a pouch she kept fixed to her back. I thought I could last longer, But this is merely a reminder that elves are powerless without the bounty of the forest and water, she grunted, switching out her usual hiding cloak for the cape. Like Asana's, this cape was hooded, and it was a mysterious shade of green with silver tinting. I could even make out a pattern that looked like leaf fans. The moment she pulled the hood over her head, Kismel's weakness icon disappeared and was replaced by a new buff icon. Whew. Already the color was returning to her face. Asana and I were so stunned by the immediate improvement that the knight gave us a proud little grin. This cape is a special treasure that has been kept within the kingdom since before the Great Separation. It is carefully sewn together from the precious leaves of the holy tree, which hardly ever fall, even in midwinter. Among all the castles and fortresses together, there are no more than 10 of these capes remaining. Oh, that's fascinating, Asana whispered, examining the cape itself. So it's made from the leaves of the holy tree? Meanwhile, I was more curious about the effects of the new leaf icon, but I couldn't just go by tapping Kismel's cape while she was wearing it. I made a mental note to ask her permission to examine it once we got back to the castle galley, and opened my main menu to check the quest log. We were about to tackle the main story for the Elf War campaign quest on the 6th floor, known as Agate Key. The format of the quest itself was simple. Collect the key from the dungeon on the south area and return it to the castle. But the problem was that out of the 5 radial areas around the center of the 6th floor, we were on the northwest, meaning we'd have to get through the west area just to go south. That meant getting through 2 of the boundary dungeons that separated each area. The first of which was a decent challenge for a full raid party, with the ALS and the DKB plus the Bro Squad for backup. Even with Kismel, that was not going to be easy. Just in case, I checked our route there. Kismel, about our destination. I presume we're heading for the key shrine at the southernmost part of the 6th floor? That's correct. I'm impressed you knew the shrine was in the south, Kismel said with marvel. Obviously, I couldn't tell her that I'd been there in the beta, so I just gave her a pat answer about understanding as much with my book of mystic scribing. As a matter of fact, the quest log did include the location of the dungeon, so it wasn't really a lie. I see. Your human magical charms are powerful indeed, the knight remarked. I walked up to show her the full map of the 6th floor, which Austin examined from the opposite side. They traced the pathways to our destination with a finger. Our present location is here, and the shrine with the key is somewhere around here. That means we have to get through the passageway under the mountains both here and here. That's going to be a serious challenge if we attempt to tackle them head on. But if there happens to be some kind of secret shortcut known only to the Dark Elves, then... I prompted. Asana elbowed me in the side. Now don't be tacky. I'm sorry, Kismel. Please ignore him. I don't remember hearing anything about a shortcut. The knight replied. She looked up and grinned. But there is no need to cross the mountains at all. Why not? We can save that surprise for later. Let's head to the center of the lake first. Kismel put a hand on my back, and Asana had pushed us onward, so I had to close my window and start walking. The star-shaped body of the water in the center of the floor was named Lake Talfa, and it would indeed cut down the travel time significantly if you could cross it. In the beta, many players did use buoyant materials and attempt to swim across it, but the lake was home to a devastatingly powerful giant starfish monster that grabbed every person attempting to cross and dragged them down into their watery graves. That would be a thrilling bit of entertainment in a normal game, but encountering that starfish in SAO was now nothing short of suicide. The thought of Kismel's interactions was troubling, but I had no choice at present other than to trust her. The 3 of us crossed the stone bridge and headed into the labyrinth of canyon walls. Sandy monsters promptly began to spawn around us, but Kismel was even stronger than when we worked with her on the secret key quest of the 5th floor, and with ease she dispatched the desert spiders and deathworms that gave us so much trouble. In terms of leveling efficiency, SAO was a lonely game in which the best way to level was going solo, but for now, there was no experience point adjustment based on level gap between monster and player, meaning that power leveling, where 1 or 2 players could boost a party by taking down huge numbers of monsters themselves, was surprisingly easy. This was exactly the present case, so I wished we could find a good high-frequency monster area and hang out for 2 or 3 hours, even half a day or a full day, to gain levels. But given that we were on an important quest to recover the sacred keys, I couldn't ask Kismel to do that. In fact, didn't I consider that very idea on the 3rd floor already? To my disappointment, we mostly avoided combat as we proceeded southward through the sandy canyons, and we reached the hills on the other side of the area by 10 o'clock. The 5 equal-sized areas of the 6th floor were spread out like a fan, so the closer you got to the lake in the center, the narrower the band of terrain became. About 500 meters to our left was a sheer rocky cliff face, and if I squinted, I could see the entrance to the cave path we came through yesterday at the base of the rocks far ahead. There was a similar rock wall on the right side, but the tunnel through that range was located towards the outer perimeter of the floor, not visible from here. The walls would steadily close tighter and tighter until we hit a star-shaped lake Talfa on the center. "Whew, finally made it through the dry valley," remarked Kismel, pulling off her green hood. "Hey, is it safe for you to take that off yet?" I balked. "It is. There are at least a few plants in this region, with the occasional spring of water." But as far as I could see, the surrounding wasteland was just barren, reddish-brown ground, with only visible plants being a spiky cacti and succulent. It did not seem overflowing with the bounty of forest and water, but the knight removed her cape anyway. The debuff icon did not reappear, but even after 2 hours under the cape, her face still looked pale and uncomfortable. Asuna noticed it too, and asked, "Are you sure you shouldn't keep it on until we reach the lake?" "Yes, as I said earlier, this green leaf cape is very precious. It would be a disgrace to our ancestors if I wore it where it was not necessary and damaged it in combat," Kismel replied, folding the cape carefully and storing it in a pouch. She removed her cloak of hiding with an extra long exhale and put that on instead. I opened my inventory and materialized a bottle of water for her, which she accepted gratefully. Then I retrieved 2 more for Asa and me, and the 3 of us quenched our thirst standing in a row. For some reason, I felt like striking a pose with my left hand on my waist, but I didn't, out of fear that my companions wouldn't join me. When the bottle was half empty, I stowed it. A player could carry as much food and water as the carrying limit would allow, but the elves didn't have a fancy player inventory and had to carry around all their belongings by hand. The same went for human NPCs, which meant that when Morche killed Cylon, all the gold and silver coins that he dropped were stored somewhere under his robes. I bet the lord of the town was had a pretty heavy purse, I thought, which was neither here nor there, but the thought gave me pause. When Cylon died, he dropped both the golden key he stole from us and the iron key. By this logic, he either carried it out with him at all times, or he took it out of his mansion to use it. If the latter, it would only make sense that wherever Cylon intended to take Asuna and me, while we were paralyzed, the iron key would be needed. When I finished the paralysis event by myself in the beta, Pythagoras' servant and secret protege, Theano, had saved me in the back streets of Stachin. So I didn't know where the carriage was supposed to end up, and I didn't recall any iron key being involved in the series of quests that followed. So if Morche hadn't killed Cylon, I doubted we would have seen any iron keys this time either. meaning that the key I had in my inventory now was an item the game only generated when Silent died in the middle of the quest, and that there was an alternate dead Silent route of the Curse of Statuen quest, most likely. Without thinking, I was scrolling through my open inventory window, looking for the iron key. I had to grab my wrist with the other hand to stop it. Now was the time to focus on the agate key quest, not the Curse of Statuen. We could return to Statuen at any time, and more importantly, if Kismel could help us cross the Lake Talfa, we could probably jump ahead of the other Frontier players making their way counterclockwise around the map. Okay, let's go, I started to say, but then I noticed Asa and Kismel were busy with their backs to me, facing a rather large cactus. I walked over to check what they were doing and saw they were plucking something red between the cactus spikes and lifting it to their mouths. "Hey, you're eating something!" I shouted. Asana glanced at me briefly before returning to her harvest. She was even doing it two-handed now, popping the red objects into her mouth at twice the speed. Determined not to be left out, I circled around to the other side of the cactus and examined the base of the nearly 10-centimeter long spikes of red objects there. Gingerly, I reached in and plucked out a round fruit, less than 3 centimeters across. When I hesitantly bit down on it, the juice burst forth. That was sweet and cold and sour and fizzy, numbing my mind with pleasure. Immediately, certain that the flavor was greater than even the B-rank half-fish sweet potatoes, I went in for another one, but perhaps because my hands were bigger than theirs, I couldn't pick the fruit as quickly. By the time I had pulled off a third fruit, Asana was already rotating her way around from the other side. She was going to eat my share, I fretted, and my haste to grab a fourth fruit, my hand slipped and it bedded itself into a cactus spike. Yow! Like with the sensations of combat, it wasn't real pain, but I snatched my hand away out of sheer instinct anyway. Asana took the opportunity to snatch the fruit and pop it into her mouth. In the end, I only got about 10 of the fruit by the time the entire cactus was picked clean. I looked at my two satisfied companions and grumbled. I can't believe this. You could have told me before you started eating them. Huh. Sorry, Kirito. Kismel, who seemed to have be in much better spirits, laughed. Perhaps the cactus fruit had some healing properties. These Celulian fruit have the most exquisite taste, but the flowers bloom and produce fruit only once a year, and what's more, the fruit can appear during any season, because the fruit fall is just 30 minutes after they grow, so when you see them, you must eat them as quickly as you can. 30 minutes, I repeated, looking out of the desert wastes. There was over 100 cacti dotting the landscape, from what I could see, but a year would be 8,760 hours long, meaning 525,600 minutes, only 30 of which would feature any fruit on any individual cactus. The odds of that actually happening across a fruiting cactus had to be devastatingly low. It wouldn't be worth wandering across the desert in search of them, no matter how tasty they were, so that might be the first and last time I would ever get the chance. I turned to my temporary partner, who still seemed to be basking in the afterglow of her meal. Asana? What? How many of those cactus fruit did you eat? Around 40 or 50. I could go for more, though. Just give me a whole bathtub full of them. I moaned, swearing to myself that I would have to come back to search for them after all. Kismel clapped me on the shoulder. Let us be on our way now. At this point, those pesky insect monsters will not bother us any more. As she said, the monsters that popped up on the hilly region mainly resemble coyotes and lizards, and neither had venom, making them much easier to dispatch. Instead, we spent the last kilometer or so listening to Kismel tell stories about her sister Tilnell, which had been the focus of Asana's curiosity. The story about how she took out the rowboat into the lake near the royal city on the 9th floor all by herself as a child and got lost for a full day. The story about how she put too much extract of juniper into the bath and smelled like a tree for a whole week. The story of how she gave Kismel an experimental tonic during her herbalistic studies that turned Kismel's hair as green as a dryad's. Asanas giggled at all the stories, and they reminded me of the experiences I had with my sister, Sugaha, years ago, but I couldn't help entertaining one unsettling thought in the back of my mind. If all of Kismel's memories of till now were just backstory, implanted memories, then they were all things that the staff of Argus, some scenario writer, had to come up with originally. But would they give such a rich backstory to Kismel, who was just one of the potentially countless NPCs that populated Aincrad? There seemed to be no end to the knight's stories. It was as though she recalled every single day that she had spent with her sister till now. If it wasn't just special NPCs like Kismel and the Viscount Euphlus, who had such a richness of memory, but every single NPC in the game, it would be impossible to even a team of writers to come up with so much material. For close to an hour we walked, Kismel's stories entertaining my left ear, and smoke from my overheating brain exiting the right at last. The gap between the two mountains' walls ahead reached the barely half a kilometer, with the shining blue surface of the lake visible beyond. We shared a glance, then sprinted the rest of the way until we reached the water. "Oh, wow," Asin exclaimed, and I couldn't blame her. The sharply curved water's edge was pure white beach, with stunningly clear water lapping at its sands. The surface was dazzling in the sunlight, the water transitioning from emerald green to cobalt blue as it deepened. Even the air seemed a bit warmer here. Compared to the 10-kilometer diameter of the first floor, the lake Talfa was not all that big, but it was still over half a kilometer across, the far bank fading into the distance. However, the rocky walls that split the floor into 5 equal sections were clearly visible on the far right and left, and straight ahead of us. It was clear at a glance that this was the center where the 5 areas met. "Hey, can we go into the water for just a bit?" Asana asked. She was inching closer and closer to the sand. I was going to warn her, but Kismel beat me to it. "No, you must not. This lake is home to a dreadful starfish monster. I have never seen it before for myself, but they say it has tremendously long arms and can reach the shore all the way from the depths of the lake." Asana immediately shrank away. So the giant starfish, which went by the name Ophthalmidas, was still in the place at the bottom of the lake in the release version. Now I was really curious and worried about Kismel's plan to get to the far bank. The knight sensed my eyes on her and smiled confidently. She pulled a new item out of her carrying pouch, a small glass bottle, no bigger than her thumb. There was a pure liquid inside it. "Kirito, show me the bottom of your boot." Okay," I agreed, but even in the virtual world, lifting my leg high enough for the sole of my shoe to be visible was easier said than done. I managed to get my right leg up, trying to stretch my ankle and pelvis as far as they could go, but about when I had the leg perpendicular to the ground, I lost my balance, yelped, and waved my arms, toppled onto the sandy beach. Asana's spontaneous laughter was stifled with a muffled "pom." Embarrassed, I want to jump back to my feet, but Kismel said, "Perfect, that'll do." And she had me lie back with my feet sticking straight up into the air, which didn't make me feel any better. She carefully unstopped the bottle and put a single drop on each of my soles. The shoe began to glow blue all over and began an unfamiliar icon lit up over my HP bar. I could guess what it meant, given the illustration of a shoe standing on water, but I waited for Kismel to explain it anyway. "You may stand," she says. I pulled my legs back over the position my head, then snapped them forward to jump up to my feet in one motion. I needed to be in the best possible vantage point to witness my partner's sense of balance after she had so kindly laughed at me falling on my butt. Asuna shot me a glare, said, "Go ahead, Kismel," and lifted her right leg, not forward, but behind her, propping up her angle with her hand. Of course. That was a much easier way to expose the bottom of one's foot without any awkward strain on the joints. In fact, probably 9 out of 10 people would have done the same thing. I was both impressed and disgruntled by the idea. No fair, I groused. After sprinkling her own boots at the end, Kismel put the cork on the back of the bottle and returned her pouch. Then she crossed the sand and gingerly stepped onto the clear water, where it ebbed and flowed against the shore. The first steps went through the surface, but around the fourth, a strange ripple ran across the water, and the fifth and the sixth step were clearly on top of it. Oh, Asuna and I said, marveling. The knight turned and beckoned us forward. "Come on, you two. Step slowly onto the water." We bobbed our heads and proceeded to the lapping edge of the lake. Just to be sure, I grabbed my partner's shoulder and held her still. "So, Kismel, if we walk onto the surface of the water, the starfish won't appear?" "I guarantee it. However, the droplets of villi charm on your boots will only take effect when stepping softly. If you run or leap, you'll break the surface and lose the effect. Then the starfish will notice you. So do take care not to lose your cool." I got the feeling that the last part was directed solely at me, but decided it was just my imagination. The bigger question was whether or not we could entrust our lives to magic or a charm that could lose its effect just by running. After all, Ophiomedus's body never surfaced. It only sent its long hands up to grab players and drag them down. So it was impossible to beat by fighting. And unlike in the beta, if we died on the lake floor, we would not be respawning in Black Iron Palace in the Town of Beginnings. I wanted to say, "Kismel, we really can't afford to die," but caught myself. That statement was just as true of NPCs like Kismel as it was to us. Even if another dark elf with the same name and appearance was generated in the forest of the 3rd floor after her death, it would not be the same Kismel. How could I possibly say to her, "It's all right if you die, but we're more important"? "It's okay, Kirito," Asuna whispered. Seemingly reading my mind, she reached out to grab the finger of my right hand and murmured, "We'll just have to walk, and even if we do fall, I have an ace up my sleeve, or up my pant leg." "Your pant leg?" I had no idea what the fencer was insinuating, but it didn't seem like it should be at that hard to do without running or jumping. At the very least, it should be way more manageable than maneuvering the difference between walking and jumping in a traditional video game, where the only distinction was the exact angle your thumb tilted on an analog stick. "Well, all right, just be careful and keep what you're doing in mind at all times." "Speak for yourself," she shot back, and we stepped forward. At first, our shoes just splashed in the water, but soon there was buoyancy underfoot. We stood atop the water, which felt like stepping on a thick layer of rubber. Once we reached Kismel, who had been patiently waiting, she favored us with a reassuring smile and turned away. Then she started splashing atop the water for the far bank. We followed. Once we'd walked about 20 meters out, Asuna said, "Oh, yeah, when we fought Wyvgi the hippocampus on the 4th floor, was this charm the reason that Viscount Euphlus didn't sink into the water?" "Oh, but hang on, wasn't he running like crazy over the surface?" "Asuna's half guess is correct," Kismel said, turning her head just over her shoulder to look at us. "The liquid I dripped onto the soles of our shoes is a valuable elixir that can only be made by villi water spirits, undying maidens. But Viscount Euphilis's shoes are woven with the villi hair and will never sink into the water. Hair? You don't mean he killed the spirit and chopped off its hair, right? I asked, envisioning some tragic drama. But Kismel vehemently shook her head. Never. A bit of water splashed at her feet, and the knight hunched her neck. Fortunately, it was not enough to break the charm itself. She resumed quietly. To us, elves, the undines, including the villi, are just as sacred as the dryads of the forest. They are our neighbors and our protectors. If we consider cutting down a living tree or despoiling a clear brook as breaking taboo, then killing the villi herself would be calling down a curse upon all elf kind. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have suggested such a thing. But then how did the Viscount get such valuable shoes? Price was an unknown value at this case, but fantasy RPGs always treated equipment for feather falling and water walking as precious artifacts. By this point, we were near the center of the lake, and the titanic, deadly starfish lurked just a few meters below us. But I was so absorbed by this topic that I nearly forgot as I awaited her answer. Kismel faced forward and shook her head again, almost imperceptibly this time. She whispered, I do not know the details, but if the rumor is to be believed, in the long-distant past, Viscount and a villi maiden, who... No, I should not speak of uncertain things. Please pretend you did not hear this. Asuna, who was about 1,000 times more interested than me in that sort of topic, sighed, but she did not persist, and held her silence as she walked. I couldn't help but wonder if the blade scar on the Viscount's face might have something to do with the story, but there was probably no way of ever knowing that. At the very least, Euphilis's water-walking boots were not meant to go to any player, so I could give up the idea for lost. Up ahead, the far bank started off hazy in the distance, was coming much closer. We had maybe 200 meters to go, and its white beach and the looming rock wall behind it were clearly visible. Of the 5 areas that made up the 6th floor, the first area in the northeast containing the main town was forest. Second area in the northwest containing Castle Galley was barren wasteland. The third area to the west was swampland. And the fourth area to the south, where we were currently heading, was designed to be caves. But it was not a man-made dungeon, but a natural cavern formation. And there were a few places where you could actually see the sky, or bottom of the 7th floor, as the case may be. So it was not necessarily a fun strolling place, but it certainly better than western area we were skipping with this muddly slog and deep sledge just off the beaten path. Once we had gotten the sacred key, we had to return to Castle Galley, but having the lake shortcut would be a huge help when it came time to tackle the floor's labyrinth, if we could make use of it. But these droplets of villi were clearly extremely valuable, so I couldn't just ask her for more, not when I was mere convenience sake. In the meantime, the far bank was growing close, and the view under the surface was clearer again, with little schools of fish swimming underfoot. At times, there were glints of what looked like coins or jewels in the sand down there, which made me want to reach in and grab them, but that was clearly a trap. I'd have to wait until we had a means of defeating the starfish first. Our usual pattern of activity called for one of the two of us, usually me, to screw up and get into major trouble just before we reached safety. But there were no sudden splashes into the water this time. We stood on firm ground again, walked up the white beach a ways, then came to a stop with a sigh of relief. Well, there's a first for everything. That was rather exhilarating, the knight said. I turned to her in surprise. Wait, that was your first time walking across the lake too, Kismel? But of course, I have never set foot outside Castle Galley here. Then you're saying you don't know the location of the underground maze that holds the key? I asked, thinking this might be a rare occasion when we were led around instead of the reverse. But the knight took a scroll of parchment out of the long, thin case on her belt and said proudly, "I have not been there, but I know the way, see?" I peered at the paper. It was a map of the southern end drawing in considerable detail. A red mark was placed within the twisting cave complex. A red line indicated the route there directly from the lakeside. "Oh, so you do have a map. So this is the lake, and this is our destination. What's this mark for? It looks like an insect head," Asuna said, pointing at a spot near the bottom of the map. "That's correct," Kismo replied, with a nod. "Lurking in the caverns is a giant centipede covered in rocky armor. Fortunately, we need not cross its path, but I hear tell of many humans who have wandered into its lair and paid the ultimate price." "Jeez, starfish, centipedes, this place has everything. I just hope there's no millipedes or ganymedes." I could have been a snob and pointed out that the last one was the name of a moon, not a creature, but I kept it to myself. In the beta, there wasn't a centipede-type field boss in the southern area of the 6th floor. Instead, there was a plant boss in the Labyrinth Tower located in the 5th and final area, and the unbeatable starfish in the lake, but that was all I remembered. Some of the field bosses had been changed in previous floors, like the giant tortoise boss on the 4th floor becoming the two-headed sea turtle, but there was no newly added bosses so far. The advancement group was tackling the game under that premise, so if the ALS or DKB in their competitive haste ran into a centipede boss in the cave that they weren't prepared for, there was a possibility for disaster looking ahead. "Sorry, give me a moment," I asked the two women, who were still examining the map, and went to the messages tab of my main menu, and fired off a brief message to Argo, the information dealer. "Where's the farthest FR now?" FR was shorthand for front runner, Argo's preferred nickname for the group pushing ahead into Einkrad. She must not have been in combat or spying, because I got a response within 10 seconds. "They'll be trying the dungeon leading into the 3rd area tonight. 100 coal," her message said, with the cost of the information indicated at the end. Fortunately, she kept a running tab for me, but the bill wasn't what made me grimace. "Too fast," I muttered, checking my map tab. The lead group moved from the 1st area to the 2nd area yesterday afternoon, January 2nd, so they were moving on to the next area after just a single day. The 2nd area had just one small town by the name of Araro. The Dark Elves' Castle Galley was meaningless if you weren't doing the Elf War quest, and the monsters outside the ones in the dry valley leading to the castle weren't that tough, so I figured it wouldn't take them long, but this was still very quick. Most likely, Kabao and Lin calculated they could take one area per day, finishing the 6th floor in just 5 days total. Given that we had finished the 5th floor in 4 days, it wasn't outrageous. But the last Labyrinth Tower was on a straight line if you avoided detours. This one required far more travel to reach. At any rate, it was clear we needed to assume the swampy 3rd area would be finished by tomorrow afternoon, at which point the frontline group would reach the 4th area. I returned to Kismel's side to examine the map. The giant centipede's lair was located a bit before Cave City, Goskai, the biggest town in the area. If the group was rushing along the path, tired after clearing out the dungeon passageway, there was a greater chance of them stumbling across the centipede cave with little or no preparation than I wanted to admit. I opened my window again and sent a second message to Argo. "Got intel on the new field boss located before Goskai in the 4th area." "Got it." She immediately wrote back. "I wipe out the cost of your last tip. That should be enough to keep the DKB and the ALS from running across the centipede boss without a clue that it was coming. However, not that I didn't trust them to hold their own, but I wanted to take part in that boss battle too. The real question was, could we finish up the Castle Galley quest by tomorrow afternoon and catch up with the group again? That charm of fast scribing you humans can use is very handy thing, said Kismel, impressed. She'd been watching me send messages to Argo. Asuna piped up to say, "The elves have to send scouts to hand over letters, don't you? Even with your spirit trees, that seems like a lot of hard work." "That's right. We dark elves and forest elves have thought little of your human charms. But seeing that what you are capable of doing, I suspect that your mystic scribing and fast scribing alone might surpass all the magic we elves still possess." I wasn't quite sure how to respond to her. She recognized them as a form of magic, but the player menu instant messages were game features, and I couldn't well explain that Argo that human players could use that magic, but NPC humans could not. But Kismel didn't show any further interest in the art of far scribing. Instead, she brought up a point that I hadn't thought about in a while. "What was it that Notza the Fallen Elf said to on the fourth floor? When they have all the keys and open the door to the sanctuary, the greatest magic of humankind will vanish, correct?" "Oh, he did say that," said Asuna, her cheeks flushing a little bit. I wondered why, and tried to recall the circumstances of that scene. We had taken a gondola trip down the river of Rovia on the fourth floor, and were at the end of the watery dungeon when the two of us overheard the fallen having a discussion. In addition to Nolza, the masked general, there was also Edu, a foreman, and a woman elf who seemed to have been at the general's aid. The statement was from Nolza to his aide, whose name I recalled being Kaisara. "Once we have all the keys and open the door to the sanctuary, even the greatest magic left to humankind will vanish without a trace." And in response, Kaisara had said, "Of course, Excellency, the moment of our triumph grows ever closer." If we couldn't use our mystic scribing and far scribing anymore, that would be a huge deal. But it seemed impossible in a practical sense. Instant messages were one thing, but not being able to use the main game menu, no choosing skills, storing items away, or viewing the map, the game would be impossible to beat that way. So did that mean the greatest magic Nolza spoke of was something else? Something the loss of which would tie in some great wish of the fallen elves? What kind of desire would that actually be? My imagination ran into a brick wall at that point. My right hand opened and clenched repeatedly in frustration. Then Asuna came marching over to me and stepped on my left foot with the toe of her boot hard. That sensation was the trigger that brought forth a new flood of memories. When Nolza had said those things, Asuna and I had been hiding in a small wooden box, squashed and immobile. My hand had gotten stuck under Asuna's breastplate, and... "I believe we've had enough rest. I'd like to finish and return to the castle while it's light out," announced Kismel, pulling me out of my flashback. I lowered my hand and silently shook my head at Asuna. She snorted and gave me a glance that ordered me to erase that memory forever, then began walking alongside the knight. There was a tall rock face before them, with a yawning cave mouth in its center. Say, the harassment prevention code didn't go off that time either, I thought as I hurried after them. I wonder if she saw the window for it to open when she woke up this morning. The majority of the cave area was not pitch black like the interior dungeon. Instead, open areas here and there allowed light in from the ceiling, and even at its gloomiest, there was still enough natural light to see by. We didn't need to carry torches or lanterns. Fortunately, the monsters were not insects, but primarily bat and aquatic types. Most troublesome were the slimes, making their first appearances in Aincrad here. Japanese RPGs were famous for characterizing slimes as the weakest intro monsters, but that was not true in SAO at all. For one thing, there was no fire or ice magic in the world to effectively counter that jiggly slime body. So we'd have to make do with our weapons. Even then, slashing and thrusting attacks were weak against the slime, with only blunt weapons having decent effect. And for our party of 3, Kismil and I shared slashing weapons, and Asuna used a thrusting weapon. Slimes were uniquely tough for us. So... Jeez! Asuna made no attempt to hide her frustration as she activated the sword skill Oblique. Her rapier lit up the dim surroundings. With a lightning-fast downward thrust, it struck the brown-colored Corvetus ooze on the cave floor before her. A large hole appeared in the center, roughly 1 meter wide. Slime. While it looked as though it might be spraying apart to pieces, there wasn't much effect on its HP. When the visual effect of its skill faded, the bits of ooze squirmed back together to take their original flat, jiggly form. I noticed that apart from its bulging outward, so I warned Asuna. "Take evasion!" This fencer leaped away when she was able to move, just as the bulging part of the ooze emitted a little whip-like tentacle. I tried to snake around the chivalric rapier, but closed on air by mere centimeters when Asuna pulled her weapon back. If it caught hold, it would yank with tremendous force, and if pulled free, the weapon would be absorbed into the slime's center mass. That made it difficult to retrieve, and the weapon suffered major durability loss in the meantime. Even if I didn't know what might happen if it grabbed the player, and they were wearing, say, cloth armor. The Corvetus ooze, so named for the way it greedily stole things, retracted its tentacles and wobbled, practically mocking Asuna. "Grr, what do we do about this thing, Kirito?" she pleaded. I glanced behind me, where a few meters away, Kismel was dealing with 2 vampire bats. Her HP hadn't dropped at all, so she was probably fine on her own. I looked back to Asuna and said at a safe volume that wouldn't call down more nearby monsters, "First, guide it into the light." "I'll try." Asuna slowly moved back to her right, until the jiggling ooze followed into a ring of natural light coming through a hole in the ceiling. The dirty yellow-brown of its body in the darkness turned to a brilliant gold in the light. But that was it. It didn't take any damage from the light, or seem distressed, or try to run away from it. "Nothing happened!" Asuna wailed, so I gave her next hint. "Look closely at the slime's whole body while it's translucent in the sunlight." "Huh? There's something there." As sharp as ever, Asuna found what she was looking for in just 2 seconds of squinting. Not just in the center of the ooze, but along the outer edge of what constitutes its legs. There was something shiny and reflective, like an eyeball, or a fish egg pouch, or one of those clear raindrop cakes. "That's the slime core. Crush that little thing with a sword skill, and you'll kill it in 1 blow," I shouted. As if on cue, the ooze curled itself inward into a ball shape. It wasn't frightened, but it was tensing itself to jump high off the ground, where it spread itself out thin and wide. If it wrapped itself around your head, you'd take continuous acidic damage and start to suffocate. But instead of backing away, Asuna used another sword skill. It was even easier to see the core with its slime body all spread out into the sun, making it perfect target for single thrust skill, Streak. The tip of her rapier left a silver streak as it struck the 2-centimeter wide cord. The translucent sphere resisted for a brief moment before it burst with little popping sounds. When its HP reached 0, the slime lost its internal cohesion and flew apart into many tiny bits. They splattered against the fencer's face and body, covering her in dark yellow jelly. She probably would have shrieked if not for the fact that the ooze turned into little blue polygonal textures that drifted away. Asuna stood there, rapier outstretched, until Kismel returned from dispatching 2 bats and said cheerily, "Ah, well done, Asuna. Not many elves are skilled enough to defeat a slime with a single rapier thrust. Thank you, the woman muttered, with her lips twitching because some of the ooze had flown into her mouth. I was quickly becoming a master of the sort of freakish foods of Eincred and wanted to ask her how it tasted, but my survival instincts told me that now was not the time. I wanted to say, nice job, with a smile, but instead I had to hold off on that too. There was a more faint sound of jiggling and wobbling in the distance. I put a finger to my lips to hush the other two and listened closely. The unique sound of slime wriggling was getting closer and louder, but I saw no cursor around. When that happened in the beta, it was usually because, above, I shouted. Overhead, an amorphous shape was dropping down from between thin icicle-like stalactites on the ceiling of the cave. Asuna noticed it. It belatedly and tried to jump back as she watched it fall, but she unluckily tripped over a low stalagmite that was directly behind her and fell on her bottom. Kismel raised her saber to protect Asuna, but if she simply slashed at the falling slime that didn't happen to strike at the core on the way through, the liquid creature would take little damage and the attack two of them directly. I lifted up my sword on pure instinct to cue up the sword skill, Sonic Leap. I would jump up as hard as an angle as the system would allow and strike the falling slime with it. Because it was just off the hole in the ceiling, the slime didn't catch the sun and it only looked like a dark smudge. There was no way to tell where the core was at this point, but I kept my eyes wide as I could, and I smashed the amorphous creature with a Sword of Eventide +3. Normally, I would take the power boost of adding my own swing to the system auto-assistance, but this time I purposely slowed down just enough to keep the sword skill from fumbling. When the blade cut through the sticky substance, I felt it catching on the denser little orb. Promptly, I stopped pulling back and let it follow through, hearing the burst of the core shattering. The slime's HP were gone in an instant, the creature obliterated before I could even read its name on the cursor. I did get a good taste of the flavor if I caught some flying jelly in my mouth, but a sudden premonition told me to block my face with my arm. When I landed, all the pieces were disintegrating into blue light. It was quite an impressive feat, if I said so myself. So I turned with a flourish and asked, "Are you two all right?" like a manga character. For some reason, Asuna glared at me balefully from the floor. It got in my mouth again. What it tastes like? I asked, unable to fight my curiosity this time. She said that the bits of Corvettus ooze tasted hellishly sour, like sour plums pickled in lemon juice. The second one dropped an item called ooze jelly, but I wasn't the biggest fan of sour flavors and decided to let it sit in my inventory to rot. As soon as Asuna was back on her feet, she pressed me for the answer. Kirito, as I'm going to set aside the fact that you could have started by telling me slimes have cores, how could you find them? When you cut the second one, there was no light shining on them. Did you just hit the core by getting lucky? No way. I don't have that kind of actual luck. Even if I did, I would have used it all by getting up to 2 particular party members, putting me well into the red to do so. A thought I kept myself, of course. Natural light is the best way to find the slime's core, like you just did, I explained. But it also works with torches or lanterns in very dark environments. But once you've hunted enough slimes to get a hang of it, you learn how to find the core from other light sources too. Other light? She repeated skeptically, but Kismel suddenly clapped her hands in epiphany. Oh, of course. You can use the flashing of your sword technique to illuminate the core. Correct, I said, giving her a round of applause. But then I paused. It was a known fact that NPCs could use sword skills. But should I talk about the extracurricular tricks involved in this case? Kismel's expression of excitement and anticipation sealed the matter, however. Asuna, meanwhile, looked skeptical. What? Sword skills give you less than a second between flashing and landing on the target. Can you really find a slime's core in that amount of time? Well, it comes down to experience and slowing down the sword skill. Slimes aren't very mobile, so if you slow the skill down as much as you can, it gives you more time to spot the core. Slow it down, Asuna muttered, with equal parts wonder and exasperation. She dropped her rapier back into its sheath. I'll admit, I think that technique's incredible, but it's going to take me quite a while to learn it. So for now, I'll count on you to take care of all the slimes in the dark. Sure thing, I said. The only thing I could say, Kismel added. Don't worry, I will learn this skill as well. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that, I said. Also, the only thing I could say. After that, we saw not just the dark yellow Corvetus Uve, but blue slimes, red slimes, and even some familiar-looking black slimes. As she proclaimed, within 3 battles, Kismel had effectively grasped the trick of the so-called skilled lighting ability. From that point on, we didn't have much trouble reaching the entrance to that dungeon, deep inside the cave before lunch. If possible, I was going to make the slight extra walk to the cave city of Goskai, not too far, in order to eat and recover supplies. But Kismel wouldn't want to venture into Human City. I assured that if players were there on the Forest Elf faction of the quest, they would see Kismel's cursor transcend red straight into black. So we sat down on the entrance to the dungeon, partaking in some of the rations we got from Castle Galley. To my surprise, the baked treat full of nuts and dried fruit was fantastically good. Even Asuna, the snooty gourmet, seemed satisfied. Our spirit recovered, we then plunged into the dungeon, tearing deeper and deeper into it, and fighting an abruptly different set of monsters, until just after 1 o'clock, when we ran into an obstacle I never imagined I would see. Huh? This was a dungeon the elves built ages ago, right? Asuna murmured as she stared up at the thing. Kismel's head bobbed in agreement. That is correct, according to legend. In the olden days, just after the Great Separation, the 6 keys were split across the 6 floors and placed within 6 different labyrinths to keep them hidden and safe. Then why would that be here? I do not know. Kismel stepped forward and reached up to the square stone panel that blocked the great doors between us, to touch numbered pieces lined up on it. It was clearly a 15 puzzle, except that, in this case, they were lined up 6 by 6, so it was actually a 35 puzzle. At any rate, it was one of the cursed puzzles found everywhere in Statchen. Kismel carefully clicked the tile next to the open space and turned back to me. This is not anything made by the Dark Elves or the Forest Elves, either, I believe. Count Galeon said nothing about there being such a contraption in this labyrinth either. No, this one was created by humankind, I said, which made Kismel wince. What? Meaning some human snuck into this labyrinth before us, placed this device upon the door? Does that mean the key's already been taken out? No, not necessarily. Besides, this puzzle might not have been literally placed by the human who snuck in here. What does that mean? Kismel asked suspiciously. Asuna and I explained with difficulty, because we couldn't explain that these were all quests in a game. The murder mystery in Statchen and the ensuing puzzle curse it had spawned. The elf knight was silent for several moments when we were done and finally said, So the curse of this human lord being murdered 10 years ago has spilled out onto the town of Statchen and has produced this number puzzle on the door of this distant labyrinth? Yep, that's the only way to describe it at this point. Not that I think old Pythagoras had any reason to curse an elf maze specifically. You never know. Curses are truly terrifying and unpredictable things, especially when they are curses set by the dead. The Dark Elves have a number of stories about those unfortunate enough to come into contact with curses unrelated to them. To say nothing of the famous tale of how the wicked dragon Schmargor came under the holy tree's curse and tormented the humans who did nothing to it. Ah, yes, you do have a point. In a sense, the entire floating castle of Aincrad was like the curse of the mad genius, Akihito Kayaba, and we were the ones unfairly trapped inside it. Although, as a beta tester as well, I supposed it was inevitable that I would become a victim. There was no point lamenting my plight at this point. However, all I could do was trust that one day beat this deadly game and keep moving forward each day towards that goal. Asana's gaze was distant, suggesting to me she was thinking much the same thing. Kismel gave the two of us a glance, then turned to the door again and said, "If this puzzle is a work of a curse, then I suppose no sword can destroy it." "Uh-huh. Yeah, it's indestructible." "Then we shall have to solve it," the knife said simply. I rushed to ask her, "Hey, do Dark Elves solve puzzles too?" Well, as children, we solve picture-matching boards and tangle rings, but I have never seen a puzzle of numbers like this. Are we meant to recover the boards in numerical order?" "Yes, starting from the top left and moving in rows," I explained. Though, on the inside, I was starting to panic. One of these sliding puzzles with 15 pieces was hard enough if you don't know the trick, but this one had 35 to deal with. I figured it would be too tough for Kismel at her first shot, and this was without knowing if NPCs had the AI puzzles like this one's called NP hard problems in computational theory, meaning that normal computers found it difficult to compute the lowest number of moves possible. "Kismel, maybe I started to say, but then my mouth hung open. After just 3 seconds of staring at the randomly placed numbers, Kismel was now tearing through them. The rapid clicking of tiles sliding into place filled the dark corridor, and before my eyes, the 35 tiles began to line up in order from top left. To our shock, soon over the 35 of the finals snapped into place. The entire stone board momentarily glowed, and the door behind it slowly rumbled open. Kismel looked over her shoulder at us and grinned. "Ah, I see now. Your human puzzles are quite refreshing." It was virtually a direct path through once the door was open, with hardly any monsters inside, so we reached the final room quickly. It was the same key dungeon boss as the one on the 5th floor, a headless Dulhan, much stronger. Fortunately, we'd leveled up too, and Kismel's presence was positively unfair, so while we did make use of the healing potions from Castle Galley, the fight was won with little difficulty. In the rear of the boss chamber was stately little shrine. Resting on the altar in the middle was a pitch-black object, the agate key. Recovering it was pretty much the end of the mission. There was no teleportation in SAO aside from gates and crystals, so without the means of fast travel, we had no choice but to return to Castle Galley on foot. It helped to know that this was just meant more time together with Kismel. We returned to the entrance of the dungeon in half the time and made our way out of the castle caves altogether, avoiding the slimes wherever we could. At last, the brilliant blue of the Lake Talfa greeted us back. After a brief break on the monsterless beach, we walked back across the lake and returned to the northwest area. There was no fallen elf ambushes on the road back this time across the wasteland, but no fruiting cacti either. Kismel sheltered herself under the holy tree cape again, and we protected her through the dusty canyon. By the time the great gate Castle Galley came into view again, the bottom of the floor above us was dyed in the colors of sunset. As we walked through the gate, accompanied by the ringing of bells, I checked the time in my window. It was 4:20 p.m. Sadly, we'd missed the period that old storyteller would be in the library, but the major floor-spanning quests like that, it was very good time. I stretched, feeling the pleasant ache of fatigue, and Kismel slapped me on the back with a smile. Nice work today, but there is more of it yet to do. We must deliver the key we recovered to Count Galleon. Oh yes, that's right, I said. But in all honesty, I wasn't in the mood to rush off to see the Count just now. I didn't think Asuna was either. Once we delivered the key and completed the quest, Kismel was probably going to use the spirit tree to leave for the 7th floor this time. The royal city where the Dark Elf Queen lived was on the 9th floor. That's where the Elf War questline would reach its grand finale. It felt like such a long way to go when we started the quest on the 3rd floor, but here we were, about to cross the halfway point. After the campaign was over, I had no idea what would happen to Kismel and us. Perhaps we could see her whenever we went back to the royal city, or perhaps not. But at the very least, I felt certain we would never fight side by side with her again. Kismel was just too strong for me to optimistically imagine that we could be allowed to take her along the totally unrelated quests and grinding sessions. Kismel, Asuna said, speaking in my stead, when we give the Count the key, are you going to leave for the next floor? She was 100 times more honest with herself than I was. The elf knight appeared to be holding something back, or so it seemed to me, trick of the eye or not, but put on her usual pleasant smile soon enough. That's a good question. It depends on the determination of the priests sent from the royal city. Most likely, I will be ordered to deliver the 4 keys to the fortress on the 7th floor. I see. It's a very important mission after all, Asuna murmured, looking up at the spirit tree ahead of us. Then she turned to the knight, took a big step forward, and asked us in hushed tones, "But in that case, why does it have to be just you who goes around gathering these keys? We've gotten 4 of the 6. Why can't the knights from the castle of those darn priestesses themselves go out and get the last 2? I don't think of this mission as being difficult or unpleasant." Kismel grinned. She stroked Asuna's chestnut brown hair lovingly, like an older sister. As Her Majesty's knight, I have a duty to uphold, and I have you two helping me. Sometimes I wish it was not 6 keys, but 10 or 20 instead. Kismel. Asuna hunched over, looking ready to cry. Kismel moved her hand to the girl's back and beckoned me over with the other. She offered quietly, "Also, in the background of this mission are a host of troublesome political calculations and squabbles. As I told you a while ago, my Pagoda Knights Brigade, the Palace Security and Sandalwood Knights Brigade, and the heavily armored Trifolite Knights Brigade are often at odds. Our leadership especially has always been competitive with one another. When the word came out that the forest elves were going after the hidden keys, there was a considerable argument over which brigade should respond. And they weren't trying to foist off the responsibility to one another, just the opposite, of course, I conjectured. Kismel nodded seriously. That is correct. It has been over a century since the Knights of Lysula left the castle for a practical mission, rather than training. Against the forest elves of Kelo, no less. The 3 brigades fought for the honor of this duty, and ultimately I was given solely to the Pagoda Knights Brigade for our light armor and fleet movement. A vanguard of 60 was sent down to this 3rd floor, but there was no Dark Elf fortress there. We were to build our camp for our base and scout the labyrinth that contained the key. There was not supposed to be any combat. She exhaled heavily. I knew where the story went from that point, and I wanted to tell her she didn't need to bother, but it was too late to interrupt. But our first scouting mission, which split the vanguard into 2 groups, we suffered a forest elf ambush. The scout group was virtually wiped out by an attack from the rear, and that when Tilnell lost her life, the commander of the vanguard requested more members from the brigade's headquarters, of course, but the request was refused. They probably knew that if it was revealed that the group freshly descended to the 3rd floor had already half gone, the other brigades would swoop in to steal our glory. No, you fought as hard as you could. They can't just... Asuna started to shout. Kismel glanced around and led us to a bench placed along the wall of the castle. She sat between Asuna and me, crossed her fingers over her stomach, and looked up at a spirit tree looming over the courtyard. We fought hard, she repeated peacefully. That is correct, but fighting hard by itself is not enough when you're the Queen's Knight. When you fight, you must win, so I do not curse our headquarters for refusing our requests. If anything, I am grateful that they allowed me the opportunity to regain my honor. But Asuna didn't seem fully convinced by that answer. She balled her fists where they rested atop her knees, and her head pointed downward. But that doesn't mean you need to do this all on your own. Asuna, that is true. That I alone on the mission to retrieve the keys, but that is not because the other knights are stirring around doing nothing. The Vanguard's commanders put together a new plan to complete our mission with much smaller number. About 10 knights would take turns harrying the forest elves and drawing their attentions. Meanwhile, 1 knight, skilled in stealthy matters, would get the key from the labyrinths. I nominated myself for the retrieval. Tilnall and I played tag and hide-and-seek in our youth, so I am confident in my sneaking. I wonder when elves play tag if they envision it as being a monster, what they think of. Probably an ogre type. I considered this briefly before snapping back to the attention. I remembered how Kismel said she elected to do the mission alone when we stood before Tilnell's makeshift grave at the 3rd floor camp, diversion infiltration. It was a very skillful plan. I was sure, but one that exposed Kilnell greater danger. She got to the key on the 3rd floor safely, but the elite forest elven hallowed knights gave chase, and they nearly killed one another in the ensuing duel. Before her sister's grave, Kismel told me she took on that mission expecting that she could very well die, that a part of her might have even wanted to. But looking at her peaceful smile in profile now, I could no longer see the deep sadness I witnessed in that lonely moment. I turned to the left, looking past the knight to my partner, who was still clenching her fists. Asuna, Kismel's mission is a very tough one, but she's not doing it alone. She's got us helping her out. Yes, that's right. That's exactly right, Kismel said, nodding deeply. She caressed Asuna's head. Since you and Kirito began helping me, I have never thought of this mission as a painful one, and I have no intention of dying without completing my task. We'll recover all 6 keys and go to the palace on the 9th floor together. I think you will like it, Asuna. Yeah, she squeaked, quiet but firm, placing her head in Kismel's shoulder. We sat there on the bench in silence, watching the color of the sunlight reflecting off the floor above grew darker and deeper with the approach of the night.